All right, let's get started. Greetings to all Zoom attendees and welcome to the inaugural session of the Prevalence Reduction Innovation Forum Learning Series. Today's session will shine a spotlight on the trafficking prevalence study conducted in Tunisia. I am Dr. Lydia Alataris, and I'm honored to serve as the Associate Director of the Center on Human Trafficking Research and Outreach at the University of Georgia School of Social Work and the coordinator of the Prevalence Reduction Innovation Forum. As you can see, today's session is a meeting, not a webinar. So we will, please remember to mute yourselves, but you can still use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen for any questions you have, and the team will address them after their main presentation. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Okech, the esteemed director of the Center on Human Trafficking Research and Outreach at the University of Georgia School of Social Work and director of the Prevalence Reduction Innovation Forum. Dr. Okech, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alataris. And I have to say that she is indeed the esteemed colleague that we've had here. Without Dr. Alataris, PRIF, so many activities would not have been as smooth as they were. So thank you so much. On Tuesday, November 28th, CenHTRO hosted the Prevalence Reduction Innovation Forum, Results from the Field. More than 300 people from across the world registered. We presented overall findings from 7 prevalence estimation projects in 6 countries, and the research teams each gave a short synopsis of their work. We'll soon share the full video of the conference and any other assets that become available. The learning series provides a layman's presentation of the more technical PRIF project and delves deeper into the application and translation of the research into programming and policy work. The first installment of the learning series is led by Dr. Sheldon Zhang of the University of Massachusetts Lowell. The team utilized 2 methods to estimate the prevalence of domestic servitude in Tunis, Tunisia. These methods included time location sampling, or TLS, and number 2, Mark-Recapture sampling. Dr. Zhang and his team will take us through the use of the research in informing their work to address domestic servitude in Tunis, Tunisia. I really appreciate the UMass team going first on this series at a short notice. Welcome, Dr. Zhang.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, everyone. Hello, welcome to this PRIF Learning Series inaugural event. And I'm Sheldon Zhang, and I'm representing my team from the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at University of Massachusetts Lowell. And today we will be presenting findings as well as policy implications. And also we'll give a little introduction and an overview on what our local team has been doing in Tunis. Here is a slide of my team, and these are the key personnel. And I'm actually joined here by my chief statistician, Dr. Carl Vincent, and also co-PI Jason Reinberg, and also my project manager, Shauna Thompson. And there may be others I don't see. There might be others in the audience. But anyway, so this project consists of 2 teams, and there's a North America-based team, mostly responsible for survey design, data processing, statistical analysis, and also writing reports of a various kind. And also, we have a partner in Tunisia, the ELKA Consulting firm that was responsible for the study implementation and data collection. As David introduced earlier, this study was part of the PRIF project, where a total of 6 teams were selected through a competitive process to explore various ways to estimate the prevalence of human trafficking in different target populations in several countries. And our team proposed 2 estimation methods to study human trafficking among domestic workers in Tunisia. And for budgetary reasons, we limited our study and data collection activities to the greater Tunis metropolitan area. A little background about our project. At the time when this project was proposed, there were many media stories as well as NGO reports about abusive employment practices in domestic work in Tunisia. And however, there were no systematic studies on the scale or extent of the problem. There were two immediate challenges to do this prevalence study among this target population. First, there were no official registries of domestic workers in Tunisia for sampling purposes. To do a conventional prevalence study, a sampling frame of some sort will be required. Second, since we plan to ask about abusive labor practices, it will be impractical and even ethically questionable to conduct surveys in or near private homes where these domestic workers work. In other words, we were dealing with a hard-to-reach population. So to overcome these two challenges, we proposed time location sampling and Mark-Recapture sampling. Time location sampling essentially uses publicly accessible venues plus the accessible hours when the target population is likely to appear at these locations as the basis for sampling purposes. Mark-Recapture or capture-recapture uses repeated sampling in different locations to quantify a target population. So this is a really a very simplistic descriptions of the two methods. I'm going to briefly cover what exactly we did with these two sampling strategies. For the time location sampling, our field team conducted extensive site visits and identified all venues in the sampling locations where domestic workers were expected to pass through or congregate. These places included public transit stops, bus stops, taxi ranks, parks, supermarkets, cell phone stores, and clinics, theaters, and the whole list of the locations where we would reasonably expect domestic workers to appear. And also because residential areas were somewhat segregated by economic status in Greater Tunis. That is, there were distinct neighborhoods where families could afford to hire domestic workers. So as you can see in that map, a total of 356 sites were identified. And we designated 4-hour blocks within the period of 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. for field activities. The time block and each venue, sampling venue, became the basis of our sampling frame, from which we drew a random sample for data collection purposes. Now here's another rather simplistic presentations of what Mark-Recapture is all about. This is the graphic description of the procedure. For our Mark-Recapture sampling, we used a random sample of the TLS survey venues. In other words, once the framework was described from TLS sampling, we used the same framework to draw a random sample. Now, for this phase, our sampling and the data collection emphasized identifying repeated respondents. That is, any respondents who were captured more than once across all our sampling, our survey sites. Okay, so that's all the survey methodology I'm going to cover in this talk. And here's an important slide. Here are the population estimations based on the two sampling strategies. For time location sampling, we obtained a total of 1,029 respondents, and the number of domestic workers in Greater Tunis was estimated to be 6,281, with possible variations between roughly 3,800 to 8,500. For Mark-Recapture, we obtained a total of 1,016 responses, of which 923 were distinct respondents. In other words, there were 93 respondents who were captured more than once. The number of domestic workers using this estimation strategy was estimated to be 5,388, and with possible variations between roughly 4,300 and 6,700. Overall, as you can tell, both population estimation methods produced similar population sizes with significant overlaps between their respective confidence intervals. Now, after estimating the population size, we need to estimate the percentage or the extent of human trafficking in this population. Here comes the important part of the study. We all know that TVPA or Palermo Convention, the legal framework, in other words, that defined human trafficking or forced labor. Now, to translate this legal framework into specific measures, the PRIF project established a total of 39 common indicators. And to ensure consistency among all teams, we were asked to use 12 key common indicators to define human trafficking. Out of the 12 indicators, PRIF established 2 thresholds to define potential victims of human trafficking. Threshold 1 contained 2 indicators. Both were considered more serious than the other measures in threshold 2. Now, under threshold 2, there were 10 categories of the measures involving different types of abusive employment practices. And the list is here, as you can see. Either threshold will qualify someone as a potential victims of trafficking. Here comes the most important slide of this talk, which is the prevalence estimations of human trafficking among domestic workers in Greater Tunis. Now, I want you to focus on the numbers in bold at the bottom. The first number represents the sample statistic. Simply, this is what we see in the sample we collected, and the first column and then also the third column. But more importantly, the population adjusted numbers, and that represents our estimated prevalence in the general domestic worker population in Greater Tunis. Overall, we find that about one quarter of all domestic workers had experienced enough employment-based abuses to be considered potential victims of human trafficking. And what is more important to note is that both estimation strategies arrived at very similar findings, as you can see across the board, especially for population adjusted numbers. Now, both estimation methods found that victimization experiences were correlated highly with one another, and there appeared to be a progression in victimization severity. That is, those who experienced the more serious victimization, that is threshold 1, were almost certain to have also experienced threshold 2 abuses. We're talking about 90% under a TLS sample of those who met threshold 1 also experienced threshold 2. And same for the Mark-Recapture sample, 84% of the sample who had experienced threshold 1 also had experienced threshold violations. In other words, there seems to be a clear directions of a progression in the victimization severity. The more serious ones, experience of the more serious ones usually predict the experience of the less serious victimizations. We further looked at which respondent characteristics were associated with the likelihood of experiencing TIP victimization. We found that overall demographic factors or demographic characteristics did little to predict variation in trafficking victimization. In other words, we did not find common demographic variables such as age, education, marital status, number of children, etc., to be significantly associated with human trafficking victimization. Contrary to our anticipation, Foreign domestic workers in both of our samples were found to be less likely than domestic or native Tunisians to have experienced trafficking violations. Overall, we found that employment characteristics were more predictive of trafficking violations. In other words, employers were actually more responsible for introducing these abusive labor practices as opposed to the victims' profiles. For instance, in our TLS sample, we found that longer hours would predict greater exposure to trafficking violations, which makes sense. Every additional hour worked daily multiplied the odds of trafficking victimization by 30%. Further, we found that again, in the TLS sample, being young, the combinations of being young and working for French-speaking employers created greater exposure to trafficking victimization. As anticipated, very few victims, let me see. As anticipated, very few victims ever sought help, and this finding was consistent across both samples. Close to 800 of the TLS sample reported having experienced some forms of employment abuses, but only 69, or less than 9%, ever sought help. Similarly, close to 800 in the Mark-Recapture sample experienced employment abuses, but only 67, again, less than 9%, ever sought help. There are several basic rights specified. There are 7 basic rights specified by law in Tunisia for domestic work. These include various entitlements to paid leave, annual leave, weekend off, and paid leave for religious and national holidays, as well as entitlement to exceptional leave for reasons such as bereavement, the birth of a child, the marriage of a child, etc. And we asked our respondents if they were aware of these rights, and also if their employers informed them of these rights as required by a contract. We found that there's significant room for improvement. This slide has a lot of details, and you're welcome to get the specifics from our final report. Here are a few examples. As you can see, the bars that indicating the percentage of the knowledge or awareness. The most recognized or known legal right was the entitlement to weekly rest. The majority of the respondents, about 76% in the TLS sample and 74% in the Mark-Recapture sample, reported that they knew this right. In other words, if you look at the flip side, about 1 in 4 domestic workers in Greater Tunis had no idea that they were entitled to weekly rest by law. Among the least recognized legal rights was an employer's obligation to pay the government fees and benefits such as paid leave for their domestic workers. Less than half of the domestic workers in our study were aware of this legal obligation on their employer part. Only 43% of the TLS sample and 46% of the Mark-Recapture sample knew of this legally protected social benefit. And the second least recognized legal right was a domestic worker's entitlement to 22 days of annual leave. Less than half of the respondents in both samples knew this right. And through this survey, as well as the early gap analysis, we learned that there was tremendous space for improvement in the awareness of human trafficking violations. In fact, terminology such as human trafficking, forced labor, or domestic servitude were quite foreign in our target population. So we believe the civic societies and the government agencies can do a much better job to engage in grassroots campaign and public awareness education. And further, we advocate and recommend that legal services be made accessible to domestic workers with grievances, and civil litigations may be explored as an option to create deterrence for those unscrupulous employers. A range of services such as mental health and legal aid should be developed and made available and accessible to domestic workers who experienced trafficking violations. There are well-developed labor laws in Tunisia, and what appear to be lacking is the enforcement. So greater involvement of the government, and particularly by the criminal justice system, to enforce these laws will be a good step forward. Now, our studies has a few limitations, and certainly will create cautionary areas and when you interpret the findings. For instance, much of the media coverage was on foreign domestic workers, but few of them were actually captured in either of our sampling method. This suggests a different recruitment strategy is required to reach non-Tunisian domestic workers. And secondly, both of our sampling methods used street intercepts, in other words, recruiting respondents in the open space, and therefore limiting our reach to only publicly available respondents. And also data collection was limited to mostly daytime hours from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., and therefore systematically missing or excluding those who traveled outside these hours. And I wanted to bring a few highlights on what is it and during the expansion space, what we're doing in Tunisia now. Our project now has a partner, the Lawyers Without Borders, an international legal advocacy organization in Tunisia. And using the study findings, ASF, Lawyers Without Borders, has launched awareness campaigns across the city called My Rights through multiple channels, including flyers, pamphlets, videos, and social media posts. ASF is also active in conducting a series of training workshops with key stakeholders, including social workers, lawyers, educators, mental health counselors, and civil society representatives, as well as domestic workers. And ASF is now in the process of establishing legal referral, as well as legal aid mechanisms to assist domestic workers with grievances. And ASF has also been engaging with the government agencies to promote and develop policies to protect domestic workers. And at this point, both my team and ASF are actively exploring other ways to accelerate these outreach efforts, and with a primary focus on reaching out to more native Tunisian domestic workers. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zhang. Oh, excuse me. So, okay. Excuse me, my voice is breaking. I'm now looking at the Q&A box, and if it's okay, I will start with the first one, and then anyone from the team, feel free to please answer. So the first question is there an understanding of how common it is for domestic workers not to be able to leave the homes where they are working in Tunisia or unable to leave unsupervised. How is this accounted for?
That's actually one of the limitations in our study findings. Because our sampling strategies were exclusively out in the open space and in public accessible places, we were not able to account for domestic workers who were not allowed to leave their homes or without being supervised constantly by the employers. That's definitely a weakness of our findings. And as we mentioned, definitely a different recruitment strategy may be needed in this case. Jason, do you have any?
Yeah, I'll add on to that. That certainly, one thing we did ask about for the people who we were able to, our field team was able to intercept was about their living situations, and the least, prevalent response there in both the TLS and the Mark-Recapture samples, were that they were actually living in the employer's home. So for one, we know that, as Sheldon alluded to, through this sampling strategy, we know that we are underestimating the prevalence of those individuals. But with Christina's question, as of right now, we cannot know the degree to which we are underestimating that. So that is certainly a limitation of our strategy.
Thank you, Sheldon and Jason. And Jason, you just answered the second question, which was, did the study focus primarily on live-in or live-out domestic workers? If both, did you find any differences? Oh, actually, second part, maybe not. If both, did you find any differences between the two groups, between the live-in and live-out domestic workers?
Yeah, if you give me just a moment here, one thing I can, I just wanted to confirm something from our findings. So in terms of any type of analysis that we did to compare individuals who are live in or live out, so just to be clear, some of the specific questions we asked, were in terms of the living situation. Were you living in your own house? Were you renting an apartment? Were you living with family? Were you homeless or living at the employer's house? And in the time location sample, individuals who are living at their employer's house relative to those who are living in their own homes had much higher odds of reporting either threshold 1 or threshold 2 trafficking indicators. But the clear kind of limitation with that is that, again, that estimate is based on a relative handful of individuals. And so it's estimated with a extreme degree of uncertainty. So we'll say that at least there's some evidence, perhaps that those individuals are at higher risk, at least through this, as we estimated in the strategy, but we cannot rule out the possibility that they are equally at risk as individuals who are living in their own homes.
Thank you, Jason. We have another question about the employers. Based on the info you found about the type of employers who are more likely to mistreat their domestic workers, will this be integrated into program and policy efforts to better target these employers, if that is even operationally feasible?
Feel free to jump in, Jason. This is actually one area that we find very challenging. Our awareness campaign, of course, is geared towards the general public with a specific emphasis on domestic workers. Also through NGOs and training all the social support apparatus, but not employers specifically. And, we welcome any suggestions on how we can actually reasonably approach employers and give them a talk. So
well, there are some limited efforts in ASF's outreach efforts. So again, ASF is our intervention partner in Tunis. One thing, we have spoken with them kind of about this, and obviously one challenge is that if individuals are being recruited into domestic labor, without contracts, being paid under the table, like all that sort of stuff, clearly the risk of these types of violations is going to be higher, and it's going to be very difficult to track, even more difficult to track, than what we have here. However, there are in Tunis employment agencies, where individuals approach those agencies and essentially looking for either, temp workers or something like that in order to hire, domestic workers. And ASF has discussed at least some efforts to share their materials, whether it's their presentations about workers' rights, about employers' obligations, with essentially, recruiters or individuals working for those organizations. Now, that's clearly a limited approach, where those who are likely to reach out to such agencies to reach their domestic workers, are they the types of individuals who are at heightened risk of engaging in these, kind of tip outcomes? Probably not, but again, we're not sure. But that is one feasible mechanism to try to reach employers in that capacity.
Thank you. The next question, I'm also happy to take it, but feel free, Sheldon and Jason. Can you please provide more information on the 12 indicators used to define forced labor?
Oh, I can.
I have some slides from another presentation that puts this in a pretty simple framework. If you'd like me to.
Sure. If you can you allow Jason to share the screen?
Or he should be able to.
Okay.
No, it's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, if you just give me a moment. Here.
And perhaps we could also in the chat put the link to the PRIF statistical definition on our website, on the CenHTRO website, that also includes the indicators and the categories, when here they are, with more information about the specific indicators that fall into those 7 categories right here.
Yeah, so I'm happy to discuss some of the breakdowns here. So these 12 items are spread across these 7 different domains, and so each of these has 1 to 2 specific items that individuals were answering in a binary, yes or no, but they were also asked, did this ever happen to you? Is this happening in your current job? And that's where we focus most of our discussion of the findings. So, for instance, with recruitment, people are asked about essentially a coercive, recruitment process. So were they abducted or confined? Whether they were recruited in a deceptive format. So were individuals asked, essentially, was their understanding of what their obligations were different than what they ultimately needed to do? So employment practices. This is where individuals are being they have pay or benefits withheld, essentially to try to keep them from leaving the job. So something that's trying to keep them there, or whether they are being subject to debt. So as a result of, let's say, living at an employer's house, they're accruing debt, which they are then paying off, through their work, as a domestic worker. So something along those lines. So personal life and properties. So this is where they're asked if another individual has control over some aspect of their life, such as, keeping them from having another job in the future, or, preventing them from participating in, religious services, being forced to engage in commercial sex in order to, repay debt. Degrading conditions. So are they, so outside of contract, are they required to be available day and night without adequate compensation? And then lastly, so freedom of movement, does the employer have control over their personal papers, or identity documents? Are they, is their control over their lives so, so much so that they have very restricted freedom of movement or communication with family members? Again, part of the challenge with our method is that we're likely underestimating the extent of this because of the fact that we can talk to these people in public. Whether they have debts imposed without their consent, and then whether physical or sexual violence is engaged in them by the employer or the employer's family, or somebody that they care about. And so it's these 12 items across these 7 domains that were used to define threshold 1 and threshold 2, for the purposes of this study.
Thanks for sharing your screen, Jason. That's great. How did you identify the domestic workers in these public spaces? Did you screen every person in a particular space during a particular period of time?
Yes, pretty much. We actually have a very elaborate field procedures, and our field team developed. And first of all, we only focused on women, excluding all men. We're not denying that the men also can do domestic work, but in this study, we only recruited women for this study. So essentially, half of the population was excluded. And secondly, when we screened, we have an age eligibility 18 and above. So juveniles and children were excluded. And then our field guideline is when in doubt, include. So we approach practically everyone that fits in that category, female, and asked them if they were a domestic worker. And the screening questions are very quick. So if you're domestic workers, are you over the age of 18? We have a detailed report in our final technical report on the kind of success rates. Even with that, our success rate is roughly about 70%. So there's still 30% who are not. So we have very specific field procedures for identifying.
And, when we were in Tunis, we were able to, speak with a number of the enumerators who were on site conducting these interviews, and they are, they're locals. They developed a very kind of intuitive conceptual shorthand to be able to pick out of individuals who are approaching these sites who is likely or less likely to be a domestic worker. And so, as Sheldon mentioned, they have procedures where they are choosing kind of randomly every few individuals coming in, approach, ask, every few coming in, approach, ask, but they had developed this kind of shorthand, for identifying them.
Thank you. Another question, did your survey ask whether the domestic workers had gone through recruiters or how they had found their employment opportunity?
I don't think so. Jason, do you remember any specific items?
I can search through the instrument, right? I don't remember off the top of my head, but I can search through the instrument right now to see if it comes up.
If I don't remember, probably it's not there. Whether they go through the recruiter, we did ask about whether they incurred debt to search for their job, whether they went through a recruiter or they found the jobs themselves. We may, not sure. I can't remember now. So certainly, it's not something that just stood out as a significant factor one way or another. That's how we don't have a code. Kyle, do you remember? Do we have anything specific to that measure?
I can't recall.
I'm going to say no. Just looking at the instrument, I do not think there was a specific question that was on that specific on the process through which they arrived at working for that particular recruiter or that particular employer. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, and I see Shanna in the chat also says, I don't remember anything like that either. Thanks.
Yep.
All right, do you have a publication that describes the 2 definitions of trafficking that you measured? I imagine that refers to the the two thresholds. But please let us know, Ashlyn, if that's not what you mean. So the two thresholds are indeed described in the in CenHTRO's full definitions document, which we posted in the chat. If you're referring to the publication for these findings, well, you can talk about your own findings, but one thing that we have planned is a special issue that will be released in the spring of 2024 in the Journal of Human Trafficking with all of the PRIF prevalence studies in the 6 countries, with Tunisia, with this being one of them. And yes, and my colleague Andre just posted the link again with the report that has the definition with the various thresholds. Okay, one more. You mentioned that foreign domestic workers were significantly less likely to be trafficked relative to Tunisians. Do you have any insight into why this is the case? Yeah, it's very interesting. How will this impact your intervention?
We were quite intrigued by that finding too. But first of all, there's a caveat to that finding is that again, the findings were generated by a relatively small number of domestic. We only, out of our over 1,000 some respondents,
only a few dozen.
Only a few dozens. About 2-3% of our sample consists of foreign domestic workers. Again, we acknowledge that in our study that this is a shortcoming or limitation. However, we also checked with our survey teams and the people we know when we were there and asking about, just give their shorthand impressions on the domestic workers. Are they mostly foreign domestic workers or native Tunisian domestic workers? They reported as easily over 90% were domestic, were Tunisian domestic workers. Foreign domestic workers were actually very few. So again, this is also somewhat biased and based on our personal conversations with our field contacts, because we were just wondering why we only caught so few foreign domestic workers.
And we also made, specific efforts to try to reach, if there are foreign migrant domestic workers, where are they going to congregate? So again, working with our field teams and their local knowledge, we actually stratified that sampling frame for both TLS and Mark-Recapture by locations that were thought to be high foreign migrant density locations, where if there were such domestic workers out in public, that we would be able to intercept them there. So we did make an effort to kind of oversample in that respect.
Right. So at least if you want to talk about publicly accessible domestic workers, I think both sampling strategies produce relatively similar findings, that roughly about 2%, less than 3% of those publicly accessible domestic workers were foreigners, foreign migrants, and whether, but how to interpret the fact that they somehow were less likely to experience trafficking violations. We actually posed that questions to our field team and our community contacts. What were the answers? It's kind of hard. I mean, I think the one answer I remember is that these foreign domestic workers tended to work for expats, foreign missions, diplomats, or businessmen, fairly well-to-do families, who were French-speaking. For whatever reason, they reported fewer violations. Jason, do you remember any other explanations from our field team in Tunisia?
I do not.
Yeah, this is something, it intrigued us. We definitely, this is also revealed one of the shortcomings in our studies is ours is focusing exclusively on quantitative measures, with forced choices and yes or no answers. This will definitely require qualitative research methods to get at more details why that is the case.
Yeah, and just highlighting that and kind of compounding on that, in the process of analyzing the data, Kyle Vincent had made the recommendation, like be thorough in checking through how certain risk factors for trafficking might interact with other risk factors, and so specifically was looking at are foreign migrants, is this less likely to experience trafficking? Is this just for certain individuals or, with certain characteristics? And it's really difficult to say with these data, because even in some instances where it does look like, for instance, lower education level is, more likely to, be associated with trafficking for these individuals. There was such huge statistical uncertainty around these estimates because of how few of these individuals that we have, in our data. So we would either need a very specialized quantitative approach that is not doing street intercepts to try to capture these individuals, or, as Sheldon mentioned, qualitative research that is attempting to understand, to look under the hood and look at the processes, underlying that, I think would be necessary and helpful.
Thank you. Okay, we have question. Have you, and I know we don't have too much time left, but have you sought support from the government for your data collection and interview process? And what is the government's perception of this research?
No, we did not seek support from the government.
Support from the U.S. government.
Not the Tunisian government.
Yes, and I should mention the question is
question.
from JTIP, right?
No,
So,
yes, well, it was supported by the U.S. government, but
yes.
No, we did not seek government support. So I'm not sure in what aspect would make a Tunisian government relevant to our study. But it might be something I'm missing. But but in the current expansion phase, we definitely, our partner ASF, Lawyers Without Borders, we're actively involving the government agencies and working within the government ministries and trying to get their support, and also connections to do outreach activities, but not doing the baseline survey.
And Mika clarified, I meant for access to respondents, potentially including employers.
Oh,
no. But for your expansion project, so based on what you're doing for your expansion project, do you have an idea of what the government's perception is of this research?
We actually have not released a final report yet to the government agencies, for various reasons, mostly because UGA has an embargo on the release of the final report. So we will, at the time when we're allowed to release a report, we will. But our partners, of course, have already read our report. We have not formally released a report to third parties inside Tunisia.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question from Penn's lead, Natasha Greenberg. If you only had enough funds to use one methodology in retrospect, is there one of the two methodologies you think you would select?
Maybe I can take this one here, guys.
Yep,
okay.
Definitely. It's a Kyle's question.
What's nice is that these two methodologies actually conform with each other. In terms of field activities, you can do both. It's all about what's happening in the questionnaire and what's asked. The time location sampling, you have to ask very intensive questions, like how often do you frequent this venue? How about these other venues? What days? What times? There could be a lot of survey fatigue. With the Mark-Recapture, all you have to ask is if this individual has been seen before, and then be able to identify them, possibly through the last few digits of their phone number. Then what happens is, when it comes to time for estimation, oftentimes the Mark-Recapture approach is much easier because there's already so much software available or packages to do that. So in theory, you could do both of them and get two estimates, one based on TLS, one based on Mark-Recapture. But it's the survey questionnaire for TLS that could, it's quite long and extensive, could introduce some survey fatigue. And also estimation is more difficult. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, just to add to Kyle's comments, yes, based on our feedback, based on the feedback from our field team, yes, the TLS, assuming both in our studies, both our methods generate quite similar findings, but in terms of field operation, TLS has definitely required a lot more labor. To start up, we had to invest a lot of time for the field team to scope out all the sites where domestic workers were likely to congregate or pass by. We literally had people driving through the cities, not only checking on the sites, and also had to have a rough estimate on roughly how many people go through that place each day. So all that required quite a bit of startup preparation. Our Mark-Recapture, of course, and took advantage of that information then later on and draw a sample. So in terms of a field operation, TLS, it's a lot more intensive, require a lot more preparation. And also in terms of a questionnaire layout, because TLS required this key item, it's called frequency to venue attendance. So in other words, if we have a key postmark locations where we ask people to constantly refer back to that location, whether they pass through, to use as a reference on the likelihood of someone being captured. We had a total of 14 those major venues, and that can get very tedious to ask someone, did you go through this area? Did you go through that area? If you did, what time did you go through? This method was originally started up, was widely used in the substance abuse treatment field, where substance misusers, for instance, go through a shooting alleys, clinics, and there are only so few of them. If you only have 2 or 3 of those locations, and that item becomes somewhat easy to measure. But for an open space domestic worker population, it becomes very cumbersome. And I'll stop there. Our time is up. Back to you, Lydia.
Thank you, Sheldon. Well, I think that is it for our Q&A session, which was really great. So thank you so much for your presentation. I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Okech.
Okay, well, thank you so much, the UMass team, Sheldon and team. This is wonderful. And thank you so much for being so bold to be the first to do a learning series. So definitely we'll have other teams coming in the next year. We'll pass that information through email listservs. But we've learned a lot, and best wishes as you continue with the PRIF expansion, as you use this data to inform programs and policies. So again, we thank everybody, and have a great week. I think it's a new week. And for those that will not see each other again, please have a great holiday. Thank you so much, and bye.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.